In the late 1800s, there were two brothers who were doctors in Rochester who decided that there was a need for some type of clinic to be able to take care of people. And so they established this clinic in a very humble beginning. But as the clinic began to grow, more and more people heard of it, not only the United States, but all throughout the world. And very quickly it became a leader in the field of medicine. This small little clinic that was started by the two brothers, Dr. William and Dr. Charles, is what we still know today as the Mayo Clinic. And as word began to spread about the success of the Mayo Clinic, the two brothers often would welcome doctors from around the world to be able to tour the facility in the hopes that they might be able to replicate it in their own home countries. There's a story told of a group of European doctors that came, and Dr. Charles Mayo not only gave them a personal tour of the hospital, but had invited them to his house both for accommodation as well as hospitality. After the doctors had a wonderful meal that was prepared for them and spent time relaxing with one another, it was time for them to head to their rooms for a good night's sleep. Dr. Charles showed each of them to their rooms, and then he headed down to finish the last of the cleanup. And afterwards, as he came upstairs, he noticed that by each of the bedrooms where the doctors were staying, is that their shoes were outside of the bedroom. At the time, it was custom, especially for Europeans, that they would leave their shoes outside their bedroom, and overnight, one of the servants or the helpers would then polish their shoes so it would be ready in the morning. Dr. Charles, knowing that he didn't have any servants or helpers to do so, and not wanting to embarrass his guests, simply took the 3 sets of shoes, went down to the kitchen, and for half the night he polished their shoes, then returning them to outside of their bedroom. When the 3 doctors woke up in the morning, their shoes were ready and polished, and yet they had no idea that it was Dr. Charles who was the one that polished them, not some servant or helper. I'm not sure what the faith tradition or practice of Dr. Charles Mayo was, but as I reflected upon his experience and his outreach, I couldn't help but hear the words at the end of our gospel today when Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and a servant of all." Certainly that evening, Dr. Charles Mayo acted as that servant to all, willing not to hold on to his prestige as a doctor, as a president of a hospital, as someone that was well known and recognized throughout the world. But he was willing to roll up his sleeves and to be able to serve his fellow brothers and to be able to take care of their needs. And as such, I think he becomes a tangible symbol for us if we desire to be able to follow in the words and in the teachings of Jesus. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And yet, as simple as these words seem, we know how difficult it can be in the midst of our daily lives to be able to be last and to be servant of all. Certainly in our day and age, in our culture, we are told that we should strive to be number one, that we should take care of ourselves, and that we should assert whatever type of domination we need in order to protect ourselves and our rights. And yet, the words of Jesus go so contrary. Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all. This was the important message that Jesus not only tried to convey to the apostles long ago, but we know moreover, first and foremost, it was a message that he himself lived day in and day out. He was willing to be last and be a servant of all. And as such, he tried to model for the apostles then and us today how it is that we are to live as his witnesses, as his disciples. As we are reading through this section of St. Mark's Gospel that we began last Sunday and are continuing on this Sunday, Jesus and the apostles are heading towards Jerusalem, where we know that he will face his last moments of life. Last Sunday in our Gospel, we hear Jesus make the first of his 3 passion predictions of how it is necessary for the Messiah to suffer, to die, and to rise on the 3rd day. And we know that this was too much for the apostles. In fact, we heard Simon Peter try to convince Jesus that this was not to be his fate. And we know that Jesus not only put Peter in his place that day, but he used it as an opportunity to begin to teach the apostles and the disciples the ultimate and true cost of what it means to be his disciple. Jesus reminded them that if anyone wants to be a disciple of his, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. And as the apostles began to grapple with this cost of discipleship, we now hear in today's gospel that as they are continuing their journey towards Jerusalem, Jesus now makes the second of 3 passion predictions of how it is necessary that he will suffer and die and rise again. And yet, in spite of Jesus speaking so plainly of what is in store for him, St. Mark tells us that the apostles do not still understand all of this. And instead of trying to grapple with its meaning, we hear that on their way, they begin to kibitz amongst themselves. And as they arrive in Capernaum, Jesus asks them, "What was it that you were discussing?" Jesus knows what they were discussing. And we hear from St. Mark tonight that there was silence on the part of the apostles. None of them wanted to tell Jesus what they were discussing, because they were not discussing what it meant for him to suffer and die. They were not discussing what it meant for him to rise again. But instead, they were arguing with one another who was the greatest. They were looking for places of power and prestige. They were looking for honor and recognition in Jesus' kingdom. And now they are embarrassed to say so, because they recognize that this is not what they should have been discussing. Instead, they should have simply been following in the Master's footsteps. And so once again, Jesus uses this as an opportunity to further share with them what the cost of discipleship is all about. It is not only about denying oneself, taking up the cross and following him, but now Jesus adds a new dimension. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And so Jesus challenges them to be able to accept their littleness and how it is that they are called to be able to serve one another, to serve each other without counting the cost. That this is at the heart of what it truly means to be his witnesses and disciples, to be able to be willing to roll up one's sleeve without counting the cost. And in order for them to do so, they needed to be able to grow in the virtue of humility and to be able to recognize that they were called not to be number one, but to be last, so that they could serve one another. This was not only an important lesson that the apostles had to learn that day and over again, but we also hear it was a lesson that the early Christians needed to learn. In our second reading tonight from St. James, we hear that St. James also is experiencing with the early Christians a sense of envy and self-ambition in their hearts and their lives. That they too were trying to look for power and prestige, for glory and honor. And St. James also has to correct them and remind them that they are called to be last, to be little, to be servants to one another. And we recognize that this tendency of envy, of jealousy, this tendency of self-ambition and self-recognition was not just a problem in Jesus' day and age or for the early Christians, But if we are honest with ourselves, we recognize that it can also be a temptation in our lives, that there are various moments and stages in our life when we are looking for power and honor, when we are looking for prestige and recognition, when we are filled with a sense of envy and jealousy of others, when we are filled with a sense of self-ambition, wanting to inflate ourselves so that we can be number one. And in those moments, we too then need to hear the words of Jesus. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. This is the challenge and the invitation that you and I face day by day. How it is that we grow in this sense of humility. How it is that we grow in this sense of littleness. And certainly throughout the centuries, the various saints of the church have taught us in various ways the pathway to holiness and saintliness. And they remind us often that holiness and saintliness, to be last, to be servant of all, does not need to be something that is complicated, does not need to be something that is heroic, does not need to be something that is grandiose. But rather we can grow in that service and that humility in the midst of our ordinary, everyday lives. And perhaps one of the greatest examples of someone who taught us how to live in that littleness is Saint Teresa of Lisieux, a 19th century saint, later declared a doctor of the church, who died at the age of 24. But in the midst of her 24 years of life, she was able to envelop a spirituality that encapsulated Jesus' words today about being last and being servant of all. Saint Teresa of Lisieux is known for what has become the little way of being able to do ordinary things with extraordinary love. And as she lived this little way in the midst of her daily life, it was not in great and heroic ways that she did so, but it was in smiling to one of her sisters that was grumpy that day. It was by picking up and doing the dishes even when it wasn't her rotation. It was being hospitable when somebody came to the door and it was not convenient. In the midst of the ordinary, everyday affairs of life, she was able to show extraordinary love. And through that extraordinary love, she was able to be a servant of all. And so St. Teresa of Lisieux teaches us, just as Dr. Charles Mayo does, that we can work out our call to holiness and saintliness by those little things day by day, whether at home, at work, at school, at play, at church, in our community. There are ways each and every day that we can enact the little ways, doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. And therefore we should challenge ourselves to ensure day by day that we are living and doing the little way, to find those concrete ways that stretch ourselves beyond that mentality of me, myself, and I, and to be able to serve our brothers and sisters without counting the cost. When we are able to do so, then we are living in the footsteps of Jesus. Then we are living in the footsteps of St. James in the early Christian community. Then we are living in the footsteps of St. Teresa of Lisieux and Dr. Charles Mayo, being able to serve without being recognized and to be able to do so with great love and with selflessness. We recognize to do so is not always easy, and that is why we come together tonight to be strengthened by God's word, and in a few moments nourished by the body and blood of his Son Jesus, so that with his word and with his body and blood, we can become that living presence to those that we will encounter this week, and that we will find concrete ways to be able to live that little way, and in doing so, we will be able to be servant of all.